Dr. Elian Mars tightened his grip on the edge of the cliff, his boots slipping slightly on the loose rocks. The air was thin on Veridia's mountain range, the twilight casting long shadows across the jagged terrain. His relief mission had brought him to this desolate part of the galaxy, responding to rumors of isolated communities in desperate need of aid. What he hadn't expected was to find a broken soul left for dead. The faint beep of his scanner pulled him forward. Life signs, faint but stable, Elian muttered to himself, adjusting the device. The signal led him to a narrow crevice hidden among the rocks. His heart sank as he peered inside. There, slumped against the cold stone, was a figure. Her pale, iridescent skin glowed faintly in the dim light, but her body was contorted unnaturally. One of her arms hung limp at her side, while her legs twisted in ways that made Elian wince. She was breathing, though barely. Her chest rose and fell in shallow, uneven gasps. "By the stars," Elian murmured, crouching beside her. He scanned her features, delicate but unmistakably Veridian. A thick silver circlet adorned her head, half hidden beneath her tangled white hair. He recognized the emblem etched into the metal, the royal crest of Veridia. "A princess," he whispered, his voice tinged with disbelief. The Veridian people were known for their strict adherence to physical perfection. Any sign of weakness or imperfection was seen as a mark of shame. If she was here, abandoned and alone, it could mean only one thing. She had been cast out. The princess stirred faintly, her eyelids fluttering open to reveal eyes like molten silver. She flinched at the sight of him, her lips parting as if to speak, but no words came out. Elian held up his hands, keeping his movements slow and non-threatening. "It's okay," he said gently. "I'm here to help." Her gaze darted to his scanner, then back to his face. Her expression was a mixture of fear and exhaustion, but she didn't resist as he reached for his medical kit. "You've been through hell," Elian said softly, "but you're not alone anymore." He worked quickly, stabilizing her injuries as best he could with the limited supplies on hand. Her limbs required more advanced care than he could provide in the field, but he managed to administer pain relief and clean her wounds. As he wrapped a thermal blanket around her trembling frame, she whispered a single word. "Serafina." It was barely audible, but Elian caught it. "Serafina," he repeated, nodding. "I'm Elian. You're gonna be okay." Her eyes fluttered closed, her body succumbing to exhaustion. Elian lifted her carefully, cradling her fragile form as he began the climb back to his ship. The wind howled around him, but he pushed forward, his determination unwavering. "You're not dying here," he murmured. "Not on my watch." The medbay aboard Elian's ship was small but well-equipped, designed for emergency interventions in hostile environments. He placed Serafina on the examination table, the soft glow of the ship's overhead lights illuminating her pale skin. Her breathing had stabilized, but the extent of her injuries became even more apparent under the harsh light. Elian ran a detailed scan, his brow furrowing as the results came in. Multiple fractures, nerve damage, malnutrition. Her body had endured years of neglect and pain. The prosthetics she had, crude mechanical devices attached to her legs, were outdated and poorly maintained, likely causing more harm than good. Who could do this to their own people? Elian muttered, shaking his head. He knew Veridia's reputation for cruelty toward those who didn't meet their rigid standards, but seeing the consequences firsthand filled him with anger. Serafina stirred, her silver eyes blinking open. For a moment, she seemed disoriented, her gaze darting around the unfamiliar room. Then she focused on Elian, her expression softening. "You brought me here," she said, her voice hoarse but steady. Elian nodded, pulling a chair closer to the examination table. "That's right. You were in bad shape when I found you, but you're safe now." She studied him for a long moment before speaking again. "Why? Why would you help me?" Her question caught him off guard. "Because you needed help," he said simply. "And no one deserves to be left like that." Her lips trembled, and for a moment she looked as though she might cry. But she quickly masked her emotions, her gaze turning distant. "You don't understand," she said softly. "I'm broken. My people have no use for me." Elian leaned forward, his voice firm but gentle. "I don't care what your people think. You're not broken, Serafina. You've just been failed by those who were supposed to protect you." Her eyes widened slightly, and she looked away, as if unsure how to respond. Elian stood and moved to the other side of the room, retrieving a small tray of tools. I'm going to fix these prosthetics of yours, he said, gesturing to her legs. They're doing more harm than good right now. Serafina hesitated, then nodded. Elian worked in silence, carefully removing the clunky devices and examining their crude design. These are ancient, he muttered, shaking his head. I can do better than this. For hours, he worked to modify the prosthetics, using spare parts from his ship's storage. Serafina watched him, her expression unreadable. When he finally finished, he attached the new devices and tested their alignment. Try standing, he said, stepping back. She hesitated, then swung her legs over the side of the table. With his support, she rose unsteadily to her feet. Her breath hitched as she took a cautious step, then another. For the first time in years, her movements were fluid and painless. Tears welled in her eyes as she looked up at him. I can walk, she whispered. Elian smiled, his voice warm. You can do a lot more than that, Serafina. This is just the beginning. Serafina woke to the soft hum of the medbay's life support systems. Her silver eyes fluttered open, adjusting to the muted glow of the ship's lights. For a moment, confusion clouded her gaze, as though she'd forgotten where she was. Then she saw Elian seated nearby, his hands working on a small, intricate piece of machinery. You're awake, Elian said, his voice gentle as he set down his tools. How are you feeling? Serafina hesitated, flexing her fingers. The dull ache in her body was still present, but it was bearable, a stark contrast to the pain she had grown used to. Better, she said softly, her voice stronger than before. The pain? It's not as bad. That's progress, Elian replied with a faint smile. He stood and approached her, holding a small device in his hands. I've been working on something for you. She tilted her head, curiosity flickering in her eyes. Elian held up what appeared to be a sleek, lightweight prosthetic leg, its design both functional and elegant. The metal gleamed under the light, its contours carefully crafted to match her physiology. These are your new legs, Elian explained, his tone matter-of-fact. They're a temporary solution until we can get you somewhere with a proper med facility, but they'll let you move more easily, and without pain. Serafina stared at the prosthetic, her expression unreadable. Why would you go to such lengths? She asked quietly. I'm just broken. You're not broken, Elian said firmly, meeting her gaze. You're hurt, and that's something we can fix. Her lips pressed together as though she wanted to argue, but she said nothing. Instead, she allowed Elian to attach the prosthetics, his hands steady and sure as he adjusted them for a perfect fit. When he was finished, he stepped back and held out a hand. Try standing, he encouraged. Serafina hesitated, her fingers curling against the edge of the examination table. Slowly she placed her weight on her new legs, her body trembling with effort. Elian stood close, ready to catch her if she faltered, but she didn't fall. With a shaky breath, she took her first step. I'm walking, she whispered, a mixture of awe and disbelief coloring her voice. She took another step, then another, her movements growing steadier with each one. Elian smiled. You're doing great. For the first time since he had found her, Serafina smiled back. It was faint, but it was there, a small glimmer of hope breaking through the darkness. Over the following days, Serafina worked tirelessly to rebuild her strength. Elian guided her through exercises, teaching her how to navigate with her new prosthetics. Each step was a victory, each stumble a reminder of her determination. She was learning not just to walk, but to reclaim the autonomy she had lost. You're a fast learner, Elian remarked one morning as Serafina navigated the medbay without assistance. Most people would still be stuck on basic balance drills. I've had to adapt my whole life, she replied, her voice carrying a quiet resilience. This is just another challenge. Elian nodded, his admiration for her growing with each passing day. Despite everything she had endured, Serafina refused to let her circumstances define her. She asked questions about the ship, about the galaxy beyond Veridia, her curiosity rekindling like a spark in dry wood. As their conversations deepened, Serafina began to open up about her past. She spoke of her exile, the moment her people had deemed her unworthy because of her physical imperfections. Her voice was steady, but Elian could hear the pain beneath her words. They called me a failure, she said one evening, staring out the viewport at the stars. An embarrassment to the throne, so they discarded me like I was nothing. You're not nothing, Elian said firmly, his voice breaking through the silence. You're alive. You've survived things most people couldn't. That makes you extraordinary. Her eyes met his, and for a moment she looked as though she might argue. But instead, she simply nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her lips. Their progress was interrupted one night by the ship's proximity alarms. Elian rushed to the cockpit, his heart pounding as he scanned the displays. A small craft had entered their airspace, its trajectory deliberate. Poachers, he muttered under his breath. The galaxy's black markets thrived on the sale of exiled royalty, and a Veridian princess would fetch a fortune. He activated the ship's defenses, but the craft was already closing in. "What's happening?" Serafina asked, appearing in the doorway. Her prosthetics clicked softly against the floor, her expression a mixture of fear and determination. "Trouble," Elian replied, grabbing his rifle. "They're here for you." Her eyes widened, but she didn't back down. "What do we do?" "We fight," Elian said, his voice steady. "Stay here. I'll handle this." But Serafina shook her head, her jaw set. "I'm not hiding. Not anymore." Before Elian could argue, the ship rocked violently as the poacher's craft latched onto their hull. The sound of metal grinding against metal filled the air as the intruders forced their way inside. Elian raised his rifle, positioning himself between Serafina and the hatch. "Stay behind me," he ordered, his voice sharp. The hatch burst open, and 3 heavily armed poachers stormed in, their weapons drawn. Elian fired first, his plasma bolts striking the lead intruder square in the chest. The man crumpled to the floor, and chaos erupted. Serafina, despite Elian's warning, grabbed a nearby tool and swung it with surprising force, striking one of the poachers in the arm. The man yelped, dropping his weapon, which Serafina kicked toward Elian. He caught it and fired, taking down the second intruder. The last poacher hesitated, his gaze flicking between Elian and Serafina. "You don't know who you're messing with," he snarled, backing toward the hatch. "Neither do you," Serafina said coldly, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her. The poacher fled, and moments later, his craft detached from the ship, disappearing into the void. Elian lowered his rifle, his chest heaving. "You could have been killed," he said, turning to Serafina. "I'm tired of being powerless," she replied, her silver eyes blazing. "I won't go back to being a victim." Elian stared at her for a moment, then nodded. "You're stronger than you think," he said quietly. "But next time, let's work on a plan." Serafina smiled faintly, a spark of determination lighting her face. Together, they began preparing for whatever challenges lay ahead, their bond forged not just in survival, but in trust and shared defiance. The aftermath of the poacher's attack left the ship scarred, but it was still functional. Elian spent hours repairing the hull and fortifying the ship's defenses, his mind racing with strategies for the next inevitable confrontation. Serafina stayed by his side, her new prosthetics clicking softly against the floor as she moved. "You don't have to help," Elian said, glancing at her as she handed him a tool. "You've been through enough." Serafina's silver eyes narrowed. "I refuse to sit idle while others decide my fate. If I'm to survive, I must earn it." Elian nodded, respecting her resolve. Despite her frailty when he first found her, she had become a fierce force of determination. Her quick grasp of technology and tactics surprised him. Together, they devised plans to outmaneuver any future threats. Serafina insisted on learning more than repairs. She wanted to fight. At first, Elian hesitated, worried that her body was still too fragile, but the fire in her eyes silenced his protests. He relented, creating a tailored regimen to suit her abilities. The ship's small cargo bay became their training ground. Serafina struggled at first. Her movements were awkward, her new legs unsteady, but she adapted quickly, each failure pushing her harder. Elian guided her patiently, teaching her how to balance, to defend herself, and to wield a plasma staff. "You're learning fast," he said one evening, watching as she disarmed him in a mock duel. She smiled faintly, her breath heavy. "I've had to learn fast my whole life." Their sessions weren't without setbacks. A misstep would send her tumbling, and moments of frustration would bring tears to her eyes. But each time, she picked herself up, her determination unshaken. Elian marveled at her resilience, her ability to turn pain into strength. Their time together deepened their connection. In the quiet moments after training, Serafina would share stories of her life before exile. She spoke of Veridia's beauty, its crystalline cities, its lush gardens, but also its rigid expectations. "I was never enough for them," she said one night, her voice soft. "They saw my imperfections as a curse. My family, they looked at me as though I was a failure." Elian listened, his heart heavy with her pain. "They were wrong," he said firmly. "You're stronger than any of them could ever be." Her eyes glistened with unshed tears, but she didn't look away. "Do you really believe that?" "I do," Elian said without hesitation, "and I'll prove it to you if I have to." For the first time, Serafina allowed herself to hope, not just for survival, but for a future where she could truly live. Their fragile peace was shattered 2 weeks later. The proximity alarms blared, and Elian rushed to the cockpit, his heart sinking as he saw the display. A large, heavily armed vessel was closing in fast. It was the Poachers again, and this time, they had reinforcements. "They're not giving up," Elian muttered, his jaw tightening. Serafina joined him, her expression steely. "Then neither do we." Elian activated the ship's enhanced defenses, which they had worked tirelessly to fortify. Automated turrets emerged from the hull, their targeting systems locking onto the incoming vessel. But the Poachers weren't deterred. Their ship opened fire, plasma bolts streaking through the void. The ship shook violently as the shields absorbed the impact. "We can't take too many hits like that," Elian said, gripping the controls. "I need you to man the auxiliary station." Serafina nodded and slid into the seat beside him. Her fingers flew across the console, activating countermeasures and deploying decoy drones. "If we can disable their engines, we might be able to force them to retreat," she said, her voice calm despite the chaos. Elian smirked. "Now you're thinking like a soldier." The Poachers launched boarding drones, their sleek forms darting toward the ship. Elian and Serafina worked in tandem to shoot them down, their movements coordinated and efficient. But one drone managed to breach the hull, latching onto the side of the ship and cutting through the airlock. "They're inside," Elian shouted, grabbing his rifle. "Stay here and keep the defenses online." "No," Serafina said, standing and grabbing her plasma staff. "I'm coming with you." Elian hesitated but saw the determination in her eyes. "Fine," he relented. "But stay close." The two of them moved through the narrow corridors, their weapons at the ready. The sound of metal grinding and heavy boots echoed through the ship as the Poachers advanced. Elian fired the first shot, taking down one intruder with precision. Serafina followed, her staff crackling with energy as she struck another Poacher, sending him sprawling. They fought side by side, each covering the other's weaknesses. Serafina's movements were fluid and precise, her training evident in every strike. Elian's aim was unerring, his shots disabling weapons and neutralizing threats with ruthless efficiency. As they reached the breached airlock, the leader of the Poachers stepped forward, a towering figure clad in heavy armor, his plasma cannon aimed directly at Serafina. "You're worth a fortune, little princess," he sneered. "But I might just kill you for the trouble you've caused." Serafina didn't flinch. Instead, she stepped forward, her voice steady and defiant. "You'll have to go through me first." The Poacher laughed, but his amusement was short-lived. Serafina lunged, her plasma staff striking the cannon with a burst of energy that sent it flying from his hands. Elian seized the opportunity, firing a shot that disabled the Poacher's armor. The man staggered, his expression twisting into rage. But before he could recover, Serafina delivered a final blow, her staff crackling as it struck him square in the chest. He collapsed, unconscious. Elian lowered his rifle, a grin spreading across his face. "Remind me never to underestimate you again." Serafina smirked, her silver eyes gleaming. "You'd better not." The remaining Poachers retreated, their ship limping away as Elian and Serafina restored the ship's systems. The adrenaline faded, leaving them both exhausted but triumphant. As they returned to the cockpit, Elian glanced at Serafina, his expression softening. "You were incredible back there." She met his gaze, her voice quiet but firm. "Because you believed in me." Elian smiled, a warmth spreading through his chest. "I always will." For the first time in years, Serafina felt a sense of belonging, not as a princess, not as an exile, but as a fighter, a survivor, and a partner in a battle worth fighting. The ship drifted through the quiet of space, but the tension in the air was palpable. Elian and Serafina had won the battle, but both knew the Poachers wouldn't stop so easily. As Elian worked to repair the ship's systems, Serafina stood by the viewport, her silver eyes reflecting the stars. "You're quiet," Elian said, his voice breaking the silence. Serafina didn't turn to face him. "I'm thinking," she replied, "about what comes next." Elian set down his tools and approached her. "We've bought ourselves some time. We'll head to the nearest secure sector, regroup, and—" "That's not what I mean," she interrupted, her tone sharp but not unkind. She turned to him, her expression somber. "I can't keep running, Elian. I can't keep waiting for you to save me every time they come for me. You're not a burden," Elian said firmly. "We're in this together." Her gaze softened, but the tension in her shoulders remained. "I need to face them," she said. "Not just the poachers. My people. I need to prove to them, and to myself, that I'm more than what they tried to discard." Elian studied her for a long moment, his chest tightening. He admired her resolve, but the thought of her stepping into such danger made his pulse race. "That's a hell of a fight to pick," he said finally. "I don't have a choice," she replied. "Not if I want to live on my own terms." The two spent hours discussing their next move. Serafina insisted on returning to Veridia, a world that had exiled her but still held the key to her freedom. "I have to show them I'm not broken," she said, "that I'm still their princess, whether they accept me or not." Elian was skeptical. "They exiled you. What makes you think they'll even let you land?" "They'll listen," she said with quiet conviction. "Not because they care, but because my existence challenges everything they stand for. If I show them what I've become, they'll have to face their own flaws." Elian leaned back in his chair, rubbing a hand over his face. "You're asking to walk into a lion's den, Serafina." "I've been living with lions my whole life," she said. "It's time I showed them I'm not afraid anymore." Despite his reservations, Elian couldn't deny the fire in her eyes. He nodded slowly. "If this is what you want, I'll help you. But we're doing it smart. No walking in blind." Serafina smiled faintly. "I wouldn't dream of it." Over the next few days, they prepared for the journey to Veridia. Elian fortified the ship's defenses and ensured they had enough supplies for the journey. Serafina focused on honing her skills, spending hours in the cargo bay refining her combat techniques. "Your footwork's improved," Elian said one afternoon, watching as Serafina sparred against a holographic opponent. "I've had a good teacher," she replied, grinning as she landed a perfect strike. Despite the looming danger, the two shared moments of levity and camaraderie. Serafina's laughter, rare but genuine, was a welcome sound in the quiet of the ship. Elian found himself drawn to her resilience and determination, his admiration for her growing with each passing day. The sight of Veridia on the ship's display was both beautiful and ominous. The planet's crystalline cities sparkled like jewels against the green and blue of its surface, a stark contrast to the cruelty Serafina had endured there. "You ready for this?" Elian asked, glancing at her. Serafina nodded, her expression unreadable. "As ready as I'll ever be." Elian guided the ship toward the planet's atmosphere, his hands steady on the controls. As they approached, Veridian security hailed them, their tones sharp and suspicious. "Unidentified vessel, state your purpose." Serafina stepped forward, her voice steady as she replied, "This is Princess Serafina of Veridia. I am returning to my home." There was a long pause, then the reply came, laced with disbelief. "Princess Serafina is presumed deceased." "Clearly I'm not," she said, her tone cutting. "Inform the council of my arrival." The line went silent, but moments later they were granted clearance to land. Elian shot her a questioning look. "You sure about this?" "Not even a little," she admitted, but her eyes glinted with determination. The landing pad was surrounded by Veridian guards, their silver armor gleaming under the planet's twin suns. Serafina stepped out first, her prosthetics clicking softly against the ground. Elian followed close behind, his rifle slung across his back. The guards parted as a group of council members approached, their faces a mix of shock and disdain. "Serafina," one of them said, his voice dripping with incredulity. "We thought you were gone." "I'm sure you did," Serafina replied, her voice cold. "It would have been convenient for you, wouldn't it?" The council members exchanged uneasy glances. "You have no place here," another said. "You were exiled." "And yet here I stand," she interrupted, her voice sharp. "Alive, strong, everything you tried to strip from me." Elian stood at her side, his presence a silent show of support. Serafina took a step forward, her gaze sweeping over the gathered crowd. You cast me out because I didn't fit your idea of perfection, she said. But your perfection is a lie. I've survived more than any of you could imagine, and I'm still here. I'm still your princess. Her words sparked murmurs among the gathered onlookers. Some looked away, their faces filled with shame. Others watched her with newfound respect. The council, however, remained unmoved. You're an aberration, one of them spat. A stain on the royal bloodline. Elian stepped forward, his voice cutting through the tension. She's more royal than any of you. She's proven her strength in ways you'll never understand. If you can't see that, then maybe it's you who don't belong here. The crowd murmured louder, and for the first time the council seemed uncertain. Serafina turned to face them fully, her silver eyes blazing. You can't ignore me anymore, she said, and you can't silence me. I'm here to stay. As the weight of her words settled over the crowd, Elian felt a surge of pride. Serafina wasn't just surviving, she was fighting for her place in the galaxy. And as far as he was concerned, there was no one more deserving of it. The council chambers of Veridia were a stark contrast to the crystalline beauty of the planet's exterior. Gilded arches and intricate mosaics adorned the vast hall, a display of opulence meant to intimidate. Serafina stood in its center, her prosthetics gleaming under the harsh light. Elian was by her side, his stance steady and protective, his hand never far from his rifle. The council members sat in a semicircle, their expressions a mixture of disbelief and hostility. Across the galaxy, the transmission of Serafina's return was being broadcast to millions. Elian had ensured that the entire galaxy would witness this moment, a safeguard to protect Serafina from her own people. You have no right to stand here, a counselor snarled, his voice echoing through the chamber. Your exile was final. Your very existence is a violation of our traditions. Serafina lifted her chin, her silver eyes piercing. Your traditions are what brought me here today, she said, her voice steady. You discarded me because I didn't meet your standard of perfection. You thought my life had no value, but you were wrong. Her words hung in the air, heavy with defiance. The crowd of onlookers murmured, their whispers filling the chamber. Some were Veridians who had long questioned their society's rigid ideals. Others were off-worlders, drawn by the spectacle of a princess challenging the very system that had cast her out. Elian stepped forward, his voice sharp and commanding. She's not just here to survive, she's here to prove that your so-called perfection is a lie. She's endured more than any of you, and she's still standing. The murmurs grew louder, and the council members exchanged uneasy glances. Serafina seized the moment, her voice rising with conviction. I am not here to beg for acceptance. I am here to show you that strength doesn't come from perfection. It comes from resilience, from facing what you fear and refusing to break. One of the counselors, an older woman with a sharp gaze, leaned forward. You speak of resilience, but words mean nothing without proof. If you wish to claim your place, you must face the trial of the crown. The chamber fell silent. Elian's brow furrowed as he leaned toward Serafina. What's the trial of the crown? It's a test. Serafina murmured, her voice tight. A brutal series of challenges designed to prove worthiness. No one with a disability has ever survived it. You can't be serious, Elian said, glaring at the council. This isn't a test, it's a death sentence. Serafina placed a hand on his arm, her grip firm. I'll do it, she said, her voice unwavering. If they want proof, I'll give it to them. The trial of the crown took place in the Arena of Echoes, a colossal structure carved into a mountain. The stands were packed with spectators, their faces a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. Serafina stood in the center, her prosthetics gleaming, her staff gripped tightly in her hand. Elian watched from the sidelines, his chest tight with worry. The first trial began with a test of agility. Serafina had to navigate a labyrinth filled with shifting walls and traps. The crowd gasped as she moved, her prosthetics allowing her to leap and dodge with precision. By the end of the trial, she emerged unscathed, her breathing heavy but her gaze steady. The second trial was a test of strength. Serafina faced a mechanical beast, its towering form bristling with weapons. The creature charged, and she sidestepped, her staff striking with precision. Each blow was calculated, her movements a blend of grace and ferocity. When the beast finally fell, the crowd erupted into cheers. The final trial was a test of will. Serafina had to stand before the council and recount her exile, reliving the pain and humiliation they had inflicted. Her voice didn't waver as she spoke, her silver eyes meeting each of theirs in turn. "You cast me out because you thought I was weak," she said. "But I've shown you strength today, not the kind that comes from a flawless body, but the kind that comes from an unbreakable spirit. If you cannot see that, then it is you who are unworthy of leading this world." The council deliberated for what felt like hours, their voices echoing in the chamber. When they returned, the head counselor stepped forward, his expression unreadable. "Serafina," he said, his voice carrying across the arena, "you have defied every expectation. You have faced the trial of the crown and emerged stronger than any of us could have imagined. For this, we recognize you as a true princess of Veridia." The crowd erupted into applause, and Elian let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Serafina stood tall, her silver eyes glistening with emotion. She turned to Elian, a faint smile breaking across her face. "We did it," she said softly. "You did it," he replied, his voice filled with pride. In the weeks that followed, Serafina's return sparked a revolution on Veridia. The rigid ideals of perfection began to crumble, replaced by a growing movement for inclusivity and acceptance. Serafina became a symbol of resilience, her story inspiring change not just on her home planet, but across the galaxy. Elian stayed by her side, his role shifting from protector to partner. Together, they navigated the challenges of rebuilding a society that had once cast her out. Their bond deepened with each passing day, a testament to the power of trust and shared purpose. As they stood on the balcony of the royal palace, overlooking the shimmering cities of Veridia, Serafina turned to Elian. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft, "for everything." Elian smiled, his hand brushing against hers. "You saved yourself, Serafina. I just helped you see what you were capable of." She looked out at the horizon, the weight of her past lifting as a new dawn broke over the planet. "Together, we'll make sure no one else is ever cast aside," she said, and together, they began a new chapter, one built on hope, resilience, and the unshakable belief that no life was without worth.